Ancient history, which at some points may or may not intersect with the Bible. All of the information in this PowerPoint is from pages 41 through 51 in your textbooks. Make sure to take notes on this video. I will be checking for your notes in class on Friday. Here we have a chart, a little timeline of Egypt and Mesopotamia, the two regions we're most concerned with. Notice how in the middle there are the dates, and look and find where the patriarchs are. Patriarchs, that's Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. So it looks like the patriarchs are in the Middle Kingdom and Ur 3, heading into Old Babylonian. That's something we're interested in. Another thing I want you to notice, underneath patriarchs, it says early Exodus. That's because there are two possible dates for the Exodus, but the earlier of those two dates would take place right around there, when the new kingdom was in charge in Egypt and the Kassites were in power in Mesopotamia. This is a map. You can find this map and the chart from the previous slide on page 27 in your textbooks. I think it's a good idea, put a post-it note right there and flip back and forth to it as you need to, just to kind of get all of this stuff in your head. And let's not forget the three places we're really interested in are Mesopotamia and Egypt, and then of course Canaan, because that is where Israel is ultimately going to be. All right, let's start at the way beginning, 2800 to 2400 BC. In Mesopotamia, we're looking at something called the early dynastic period. The people in power were the Sumerians. They are the earliest civilization that we know of in the historical record, and they're credited with the start of things like math, astronomy, law, medicine. They're also one of the first civilizations to really be urbanized. That means that they lived in cities, and their culture really influenced the region after them. So all of the empires, dynasties that came after the Sumerians owe a lot to the Sumerians. Over in Egypt at this time, we have what's called the Old Kingdom, and this is the time frame when the pyramids were built. Okay, this is about 800, 400 years before Abraham. So the Hebrew slaves were not building the pyramids. Those were built way back in the Old Kingdom. All right, moving on, 2400 to 2200 BC. Over in Mesopotamia, after the Sumerians, we have the dynasty of Akkad, so named because their capital city was in Akkad. The major guy here is King Sargon I. He is a military conquering hero, and later on other kings would take his name as kind of to show that they want to be as great as King Sargon I. His empire lasted around 150 years, and there's a nice little picture of what he might have looked like, pointing at the citation. In Egypt, still the Old Kingdom, so we're still looking at that same time frame that we were where the pyramids were being built. 2200 to 2000 BC. In Mesopotamia, we have a time, it's called Ur 3, because the main city was of Ur. There was about 100 years where these Akkadian kings were in power, and after them, there was a Sumerian Renaissance, which means the Sumerians came to power again. This happened under King Ur-Nammu. It was a smaller territory than Akkad had been under Sargon I, and ultimately they were overthrown by the Elamites. And after that, there was power kind of among the city-states, more regional power than one localized power. Over in Egypt, we have something called the First Intermediate Period that happens during this time. This was kind of a dark period in their history. It was very chaotic, a lot of disunity, some anarchy, there wasn't like a strong leadership at that point. And then after the First Intermediate Period, we have something called the Middle Kingdom. And this is where we think there might have been some trade relations with Palestine, with Canaan. And so this is generally when we think the patriarchs interacted with Egypt. We know of a story where Abraham, goes down to Egypt, or when Jacob, and Joseph ultimately interact with Egypt. This is kind of around the time that probably happened. All right, 2000 to 1600 BC. Over in Mesopotamia, this is called the Old Babylonian Empire. So, later on in the Old Testament, we'll hear about Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar. They are all part of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. This is before them, about 1,000 years before them, and this is the Old Babylonian Empire. This was Amorites, was the ethnic group that was in charge in Old Babylon. And Hammurabi was the most notable leader. He's the famous one. Even if you haven't really studied a lot of ancient history, most people have heard of Hammurabi because he was very successful with his military, and more than that, he had this collection of laws called the Code of Hammurabi. And this was something that we're going to be looking at later on as we get into Moses and the Ten Commandments and the laws for Israel. People see a lot of connections, but also a lot of pretty significant differences between those laws and this Code of Hammurabi. He was a great leader, but the dynasty kind of faltered after his death, and no one really was able to surpass him. Over in Egypt, we have something called the Second Intermediate Period, and we have these kind of mysterious people called the Hyksos. All right, the Hyksos. They were a Semitic people. So Semitic is just kind of a ethnic label. The people from Israel are also Semitic. So this is just another people group. They're not Egyptians by heritage, and they took control of the country. And they were in power for a few hundred years, but then the Egyptians reestablished dominance around 1550 BC. So, again, we don't know for sure, but it seems like it was probably during this time of the Hyksos where the Israelites came in with Joseph and then were able to kind of grow and multiply and flourish. And then after 1550 BC, perhaps as a result of this conflict between the Egyptians and the Hyksos, the Hebrews were then enslaved. So, okay, what's the cash value of all of this? Why do you need to know? The fact is, we don't know exactly when Abraham, Jacob, Joseph, and Moses lived. We don't have, a tablet that says Abraham was here, hashtag 2020 BC. It's all kind of speculative based on the evidence. But based on that evidence from history, we can estimate which of these other empires they might have interacted with. What's more interesting than trying to place the individual figures and their stories is to note the archives of texts from these time periods, because they help us understand the genre and the context of the Pentateuch as a whole. We can look at other texts that are coming from either the same time or earlier on in history, and it helps us understand, what was Moses talking about with this creation narrative, or what's the deal with this flood story? As we look at parallel texts from other cultures and from other empires, it gives us a better understanding of the Old Testament. And we'll be doing that in class as we move on.